So, the session, A Tale of Two Hospices, Partnerships, Integration and Merger. Nigel Hartley and Sarah Weech, Chief Exec and Chair from Mountbatten, Isle of Wight, and Countess Mountbatten Hospice in Southampton. Dr. Carol Davis, Consultant Palliative Care Physician from the University of Southampton, and Carol Alstrom from Southampton CCG, who is also a trustee of Mountbatten, Isle of Wight, and Countess Mountbatten Hospice in Southampton. There are some speaker profiles on the Hospice UK website, so further details you can find there. And just briefly, over recent years, it's been widely suggested that hospices should find ways of developing partnerships in order to sustain their impact and also to develop new models for the future. This session will explore the process of instigating, developing and formalising a partnership between two hospices in the south of England. I think it will also go on to talk about the process to date and the plans for the future, a time of negotiation, compromise, complexity and real partnership. And I think this is a really apposite presentation today, because I think right across the country hospices are looking at better ways of integrating and coming together to work in partnership. Certainly in Greater Manchester, we have the Greater Manchester Hospice Partnership, which is being driven by the Greater Manchester Devolution Agenda. So this is a really apposite presentation today, and we really look forward to it. So over to Nigel.
Thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming so early to the early session. As Alan said, I'm Chief Executive of Mountbatten, Isle of Wight, and of Countess Mountbatten Hospice, Southampton. We're still getting used to saying that, and it's been quite an interesting couple of years to get us to this point. And I suppose today you're going to hear sort of various sort of views of the same story, but from different angles. And of course, the story yet isn't complete. So we're going to hear part of a process of how we've got to where we've got to. And of course, the story will continue developing, and we look forward to that developing and hopefully sharing more of that with you into the future. So there are different sort of views of the story. There's a story of real potential and possibility, but there's also a story of challenge and problems and difficulty. I wouldn't be honest if I didn't stand here today and say that it's been quite complex and continues to be so. But actually, we believe it's the right thing to do. So where we are in the process at the moment, everything's sort of signed and sealed, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what has been signed and sealed and where we are with that. But as I say, it's only a moment in time that you're going to hear about. So we're talking about an area of the south of England. The Isle of Wight's quite defined, and actually we're quite fortunate with that. But as we enter into the mainland, we actually, of course, bump up against colleagues and future colleagues developing services around us, and that's been part of the process too. So what I don't want to do is make this whole thing about geographical boundaries, but more around sort of population need, and I think that's really been our driver in many ways. So just very quickly, some thank yous, because there's been a number of stakeholders involved in this, and I do want to thank people for their engagement in that. And that includes a number of stakeholders that I'll share with you in a minute. But there's also been people who are not represented today that we need to make sure they're acknowledged and thanked. And certainly I've really welcomed the support I've had from CEOs of local hospices, where we've had a lot of informal conversations and meetings talking around how we get to where we've got to. There is, of course, a lot that we can't yet share with you because it's not quite yet we can't quite articulate it. So hopefully what we will share with you will be something useful. So just some background. There's a lot of informal conversations, began about 3 years ago with a range of people, and that turned into more formal meetings, followed by a tendering process. So Countess Mountbatten Hospice, and Carol will say more about this, and she knows more about it than I do, has been run by the NHS for the last 40 years or so. And the local hospital, the trust, are contracted with the CCGs to provide that service. So we have two phases. So at the moment, we're in subcontract with the hospital, Mountbatten, to provide services, and from April, we'll be contracted directly by the CCGs. And the University Hospital Southampton, when it went out to tender, after a lot of conversations, asked for a local hospice to move Countess Mountbatten towards independence within the next 3 to 5 years and towards a 60-40 financial split. So that's 60 from charitable income and 40 from the NHS. At the moment, it's 90 and 10. The both CCGs have committed to keeping the funding at 90-10 until 2020 in the first instance. So in a sense, I'm not too worried about this being a financial, the financial being totally the focus of this exercise. It's been quite interesting. There's a lot of other things that are really important. So from April, we will have a direct contract from the CCG, and we will be registered with the Care Quality Commission. Interestingly, one of the things after the NHS running the hospice for 40 years has been trying to work out with them how much it actually costs. And that's been an incredibly complex process and continues to be so. The direct costs are actually quite easy, but there's a whole load of stuff behind the scenes that the hospital provide that they've found very difficult to unpick and unpack. So over the next 5 months, they have committed to not charging us anything for back office costs as we find out what they really are. And I suppose just thinking of the main stakeholders, as I said, so Countess Mountbatten Hospice Charity, which are a small charity attached to Countess Mountbatten Hospice, very early in the process sort of put their hands in the air and said, we don't want to lead this process. We don't want to take the hospice forward towards independence. We don't believe it's our skill set. So they pulled out of that process quite early. University Hospital Southampton, who are currently commissioned and we're subcontracted to, Southampton City Clinical Commissioning Group, West Hampshire Clinical Commissioning Group, and of course Mountbatten, Isle of Wight. I think one of the things for myself over this process has been how we create a story that's manageable for every stakeholder. And that's been part of the complexity, of course, because we all have our interest in this working or not. We all have different angles we view it from. And one of the key things for me, when things have felt at a sort of impasse and felt blocked, it's been around really getting everyone back to the table. There's been a lot of work talking with individuals, trying to understand what their story needs to be in order to make this manageable. I hope that makes sense. But that's been a really big part of the process. And particularly when we got into comms, more public comms, which I'll talk about in a minute. So I'm just going to give you some brief history of Mountbatten, Isle of Wight. Carol will give us a little bit of history around Countess Mountbatten. But in a sense, I don't want this to be about history either, because this is about something looking to the future. But it is interesting to look at it. So Mountbatten, Isle of Wight opened in 1982, just over 35 years ago, as a result of a campaign following the death of Earl Mountbatten in 1979. And itself was run by the NHS for 10 years, but in 1992 became an independent charity. So almost sort of 30 years before Countess Mountbatten really has taken this plunge. I know Countess Mountbatten over the years have talked about this previously, so it wasn't a new thing, but actually what's interesting is the energy and the motivation that's made it happen at this particular moment in time. So our annual budget on the Isle of Wight is around 8 million, with around 33% from the CCG contract on the island, and we raise about £5 million a year from the island population. The population is quite small on the Isle of Wight. It's really interesting, around 150,000. But I always say, having worked at St Christopher's in South London with a 1.5 million population, I actually don't believe the complexity of the Isle of Wight is any different. The reasons for the complexity are different, but the complexity itself is very challenging. And the demographic is thought to be 20 years ahead of the rest of the UK. So there's a real pressure to get something right on the Isle of Wight now, rather than wait for this future that we're told is coming towards us. And I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but the last 3.5 years to 4 years have been really around getting our house in order on the Isle of Wight. in many ways, and there have been a number of things we've focused on to do that. And I think, in a sense, the timing for us of when this happened was absolutely perfect. So the opportunity that came up with Countess Mountbatten came up at exactly the right time for the organisation, where we were strategically, politically, and also with our confidence in terms of what we're doing. But very much what we've been trying to do is to create a blueprint, as many of you are in your own hospices, for the future. Because, of course, we can no longer carry on doing what we've always done. We know that. And again, just picking out a couple of things around here that have been really helpful to us. You know, we support around 1,000 people a day across our community, which is quite a high number in terms of the size of population and also the size of the hospice. And our coordination centre, which has now been running since January, has been one of the main sort of drivers behind that. And that's been really trying to find everyone on the island within the last 5 years of life. You know, hey, you can stick your hand in the air and say whatever, but actually moving, you know, hospices in the last weeks and months, then to the last year, as we talked about for a long time, actually thinking a lot more longer term about introducing people, getting to know them, so that we can plan with them well ahead, so that, in a sense, they're not then becoming a drain on resources right at the end of life. So a lot of people who are coming into that, being referred through the GP and the electronic patient record system on the island, are mostly sort of older, frail people on the Isle of Wight and people with long-term conditions. So we then put in an assessment from one of our specialist nurses at the hospice, and we put a care plan in place, and then we withdraw, but with a 24/7 helpline. We have been quite taken aback around the demand for that service, so it's grown incredibly quickly, and it is one of our sort of stress points at the moment in terms of where we'll go with it in the future, but we're beginning to look at that. So, you know, that's just one example, perhaps, of the kinds of things we've been looking at to change our sort of view, if you like, into the local community in terms of what they need. So why would we do this from the island at this particular time? Well, the island is an extraordinary place. I remember someone saying to me when I went there, you know, your sort of your career, you're committing suicide in your career going to the Isle of Wight. Actually, it's been the most extraordinary place to be for all kinds of reasons. And I think it is quite unique in all kinds of ways. But actually, on the downside, it is quite isolated. The geography of it keeps it very separate. There's a mentality about being separate. And how you then link that to the mainland and the kinds of things that need to be happening can be really problematic. But actually, we have a health and social care system on the island that's failing, as many areas of the country. And one of the things I think is quite challenging that I hadn't quite considered is how do you remain successful in a failing system with everyone around you, in a sense, not playing ball in quite the right way, not sort of thinking with the same mindset. A lot of patients from the Isle of Wight now are going to Southampton Hospital for treatment. It's quite common. We get calls from families of Isle of Wight patients saying, we're in the hospital in Southampton, we need to get home. So a lot more work and a lot more sort of partnership in that way is already happening. And also there's a real move, of course, with integrated commissioning onto the mainland with the STPs, and I would much rather be part of that than sit isolated from it in terms of being told what we're going to do. In terms of financial benefits, I'm not really yet sure about that. I think we talk a lot, don't we, around the economies of scale, and of course there are some, but I just don't think it's the main reason to do this. And we will, you know, in a sense, that's part of the story that needs to still continue. So where we've actually got to in terms of the partnership, we've kept legally both organisations are separate. So on the 1st of October this year, Mountbatten Isle of Wight basically subsumed the Countess Mountbatten Hospice charity. So we became the sole stakeholder in that charity. So we basically run it. And then on the 1st of November, we 2P'd over all of the staff, apart from the medical team, into the Countess Mountbatten Hospice charity. And we, as I said, from April, we will then be directly contracted with the CCG. So both hospices have remained separate legally as separate entities. And that was a real driver from our trustees and, of course, from our local community. And it's interesting, thinking around the comms around this, that we had to create a story for our community that was acceptable to them for us doing this. I mean, the Isle of Wight community is extraordinary, but actually it can be incredibly conservative. So sharing this with them and getting their buy-in was a really important thing. And personally for me, if the community had turned around and caused problems, for me that was non-negotiable. We would have pulled out immediately. And that for me was a real driver. So 2 organisations separate. We have 1 senior management team, and we are going to be appointing in April a new director of operations who will be based at Southampton, who will be our person over there. The board of trustees, in a sense, is 1 board of trustees, but at either end of it, there are some trustees who are solely responsible for the 2 organisations, and the ones in the middle joint. We did consider a number of different structures, and one of the questions is whether this is the final structure. It's a place to start. I imagine within the next 5 years things will move even further as we become more confident. But we considered all options, and this is where we decided to start. So as I said, the charity is now a solely owned subsidiary of Mountbatten. All of the NHS staff TP'd over on the 1st of November. And they remain separate entities. So hopefully that just gives you a very basic structure of where we're starting, but it really is a start. It's not, we will probably move this quite quickly as we move forward into the next year or so. And then just finally, before handing over, thinking around, the story has to be acceptable for everyone and what's in it for everyone. I think is a really important thing. We had huge amounts of conversations, first of all, with the senior management team on the island of whether this is something we wanted to do, we thought was the right thing to do, we felt we had the capacity to do. And with the trustees, we had a number of very detailed meetings in terms of hearing people's views and watching people's views change as we began to develop the story and the conversation. There's something really important, and you know this already, around sort of supporting each other in public, but only when you disagree, do it behind the door, so no one is actually hearing that story. I think leadership teams and individuals are really interesting. So I think in terms of, at the moment where we are in the particular development, there are new individuals appearing who become important in this particular time of the story and really helping us to make things move forward. And that feels really right and proper. Allowing people to have ideas and trying them out is a really hard one, isn't it? Because, you're sort of ahead of the game all the time and someone comes along and throws a bit of a curveball. But actually sometimes with some people it's really important to let them have a go of that. Seizing the moment, I think, was really important. One of the things I kept saying is this opportunity won't come along again because someone else will do it if we don't. So we have to really believe if we're not going to do it, it's not going to come back again. Organisational stories are really crucial, I think, in terms of listening to people. It's interesting, when I got to the island, and now I'm experiencing exactly the same at Countess Mountbatten, everyone wants to tell me their version of the story. And of course, Countess Mountbatten Hospice has a glorious past. And having worked at St Christopher's, I'm very well aware of that in terms of people's stories and how they want to sort of use that past in terms of moving into the future. But actually what I keep saying, the future could be as glorious as the past. And we mustn't sort of think that, everything that's been good about these places is over and done with. Communication, really important of getting the story right. And, again, I find myself saying when I'm meeting with groups of people now, we're not all going to be here at the end of this. Let's be honest about it. Some people won't want to be part of this new world because it just won't suit you, and that's fine. And we need to be acknowledging that. Sticking with decisions versus changing your mind, that's something I find constantly challenging, and as I'm sure many of you do. How long do you dig your heels in for before sort of admitting that something isn't working? And I suppose there's something for me around success. So, for instance, last week we had a group of middle managers from Countess Mountbatten together with middle managers from Mountbatten Isle of Wight on a week's management course together. And watching people change their views, and that becoming part of the story has been a really interesting thing to watch. So I'm going to hand over to Carol, and I'm going to come back at the end, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions, because this is evolving, your questions are going to be really important to us, because it might help us to think differently. So please, I hope we have some time for that. So Carol.
Hello, my name is Carol. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk today. There was a lot going on in 1977. It was the Queen's Silver Jubilee. Red Rum won the Grand National for the third time. You could fly across the Atlantic with Freddie Laker for £47. Elvis Presley died. The Sex Pistols are around. Morecambe and Wise are in their heyday. And I added this picture, which was the most decorated soldier of World War I, who died in 1977. And Countess Mountbatten House opened in Southampton, the second NHS Hospice. So this plaque is, I think, quite interesting. This Macmillan Unit for Continuing Care was opened by Lord Mountbatten, Earl Mountbatten, who you see there. The building and equipping was made possible by grants from the Lillian Board and Macmillan Funds of the National Society for Cancer Relief, and the efforts and contributions of the people of South Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. So it was, from the outset, it was a hospice for a large geographical area. From the outset, it was a 25-bedded hospice with a community team and a visiting service to the acute hospitals of Southampton and beyond. It had a charitable side, the Friends of Countess Mountbatten House. And as Nigel's already said, that charitable side always stayed quite small till recently. Daycare service, and from the very beginnings, there was a very deep ethos that palliative care was about influencing the care of far more people than you directly see, and education was something that was invested in and grew over time. I can't show you photographs of everybody who was involved, but I need to acknowledge Richard Hillier's vision. He was in there from the beginning. It was his baby, so to speak, and there was a little bit of rivalry between him and Robert Twycross to get the first NHS Hospice. Sobel beat CMH by a few months. And there's Frances Sheldon. I don't know if any of you knew Frances, an amazing woman, a social worker, a pioneer of psychological and social palliative care, president of the APC, etc., etc., and a good friend who was a key part of CMH and who sadly needed to use our service as she was dying. Graham Thorpe came from the Isle of Wight to Countess Mountbatten House to join Richard as a second consultant just after the beginning of the 1980s. And he shall be forever immortalised in David Clarke's book, because it was Graham who apparently said to Richard in conversation, should we be offering a service to South Hampshire or a little bit of heaven to a few? And that too has been one of the ethoses all along, that actually we want to provide as good a service as we possibly can to as many people who might need it as we can, and influence the care of as many other people as we can. So then we move on a few years, and here is the plaque when Countess Mountbatten came to lay the foundation stone of the new build in 1999, and there's her godson, Prince Charles, opening the new build the following year. These were in many ways our heyday. I moved from the Marsden to Southampton in 95. It was a thriving, busy, exciting place, and it still is. And I think at that time we felt that we were in charge of our destiny, and I think that's something that's changed over the last few years. More of that a bit later. Fast forward a bit to 2008, a landmark year for us. So University Hospital Southampton, with a new chief exec in place, Mark Hackett, got Price Waterhouse in to do service level reporting. And they reported that there were 13 loss-making services in the trust. I remember it very well because I was the lead for cancer at the time. And it was no surprise to me because I already knew this. But unfortunately, I owned several of the loss-making services. It was naught to do with me, I promise you. And one of them was our palliative care service. So we sat down and we made a strategy. And we said, we're not loss-making, we're just not income-generating. We have a very small charity that's contributing at that time, about £750,000 a year, plus some more money over and above that made the hospice the hospice. We need the charity to evolve from its previous model to an active fundraising charity. I taught myself, and others taught me, about PLICs, patient-level income and costings, because that looked to be the way we needed to be going. And then there was a bid for PBR sites for Cinderella specialties. They actually called it that. That was really nice. And palliative care was one of those. So we bid to be part of the Cinderella thing and were successful. So we did a lot of bottoms-up costings. There was lots of collaborative working between CMH and the finance department, and a particularly user-friendly and clinician-friendly accountant called Fiona Boyle, who was amazing. We had a year to do the work, and we developed a local currency and a local tariff. It wasn't adopted to go further nationally, which again was probably no surprise, but we absolutely adopted it locally. So in 2010-11, we had a shadow tariff that was agreed with the CCGs, and the tariff went live in April 2011 and has been rebased every year since. And all the activity across our whole service, which is across all settings, including the acute hospital, runs on that tariff. In 2012, there was the opportunity to be part of the palliative care funding review, and this is what our chief exec wrote as our bid, or in fact what I wrote for him. I remember learning that actually you actually quite often write letters for chief execs. I don't know what the chief execs in the room think. I'm sure you do your own. Anyway, we built on the fact that we had done this PBR stuff, and we became one of the 7 adult palliative care sites. And I remember going to the meetings up at the Elephant and Castle, and I remember, and I was leading the service at this point in time, and I remember really thinking that the future was about the NHS having a core element to all hospice and palliative care services, and that's something that's driven me over the years. But it's clearly I am becoming old and grotty because I went to university in 1977, although I didn't have a hat like those hats. And I'm beginning to feel a bit old. And I understand that my vision of that is not something that the modern NHS wants to afford. So the story continues. Charitable fundraising became quite problematic for the charity, who put lots and lots of effort in. So we landed up in a situation where they were giving a block grant of about £500,000 a year to a service that across all settings cost £5.6 million. So we've been lean and mean. That's a 27-bedded hospice, a busy community team with over 1,000 new patients a year, a busy daycare, and a hospital service at that time seeing about 2,000 people a year. In addition, they gave another lump of money that was over and above through the patient care group. So the total contribution was just over £1 million. There were ongoing high-level discussions between the Countess Mountbatten House and the Trust and the Countess Mountbatten Hospice Charity, which is what had come out of that 2008 change in everything. The Friends had evolved into this other new charity, and the commissioners. But things started to go wrong. We lost our bereavement service, we lost our education team. I have to say, looking back on it, and I've done a lot of reflection for today, I think that's when certainly I felt that we were no longer really able to play a part in our destiny, in where we wanted to be in our future. And in 2016, the charity suggested that they'd stop the block grant and put it all into hospice at home, because we knew we desperately needed and wanted a hospice at home service. But that would have left 100% NHS-funded hospice, and that was not somewhere our trust wanted to go, and it was not something that we thought was the right thing to do. And out of that, that was a catalyst for the things that Nigel's talked about. There will be a transition to an independent hospice by April 2019. So I'm left with a degree of ambivalence. Yeah, I do feel that the NHS ought to put a certain amount of funding into all hospice and palliative care services, and that it should be equitable, but it's not. I do feel sad that some of the changes are going to mean that our comprehensive specialist palliative care service across all care settings, unified by a single patient electronic record, is going to be challenged. But on the other hand, I think that we can find ways of working with that. The Countess Mountbatten House with Mountbatten Isle of Wight can find ways to pull out the best from the NHS. So there are some big advantages if you're a hospice to being in the NHS. Infrastructure. You know, there's a big, ginormous system. We're one of the fifth biggest hospital trust in the country. So stat and mandatory training, HR, finance, all that stuff is there. We have an interim medical examiners group, which answers a lot of the worries about Gosport, that's well established and which CMH is part of. And the art of this, and I have every faith that the people involved are going to capture that and use their artistry, is to catch the best of what we've got now and build for the future. And I think that the changes that are happening will mean that Countess Mountbatten House can properly build the service for the future and fly. Thank you.
Good morning. So my name is Carol Alstrom, and I have a slightly unique position in that, as well as being a commissioner in Southampton City CCG as Associate Director of Quality, I'm also a trustee for Mountbatten and have been for about 5 years, and have a much longer relationship with Mountbatten Isle of Wight in that I've worked on the island for many, many more years than that. So I've been in a quite unique position, being able to see how things have progressed over the last few years. So from Southampton City CCG's perspective, we absolutely recognise that the services that have been provided at Countess Mountbatten have been of a high quality. But actually, when we started to look at the breadth of end-of-life services provided in Southampton, we recognised that actually there was a need to do more and to do things differently. And try and shift some of the focus away from just around hospice-based inpatient services. And you've already heard quite a lot about University Hospital Southampton as an the NHS incumbent provider. And whilst many of the services that are provided EHS, including Countess Mountbatten, are very good in their services, Countess Mountbatten, for any of you who know Southampton, is actually right over the other side of the city. And whilst in terms of mileage that's not very far, perhaps 3 or 4 miles as the crow flies, when you're trying to get across the busy city in the middle of the day or perhaps at rush hour, that journey can actually be quite difficult and can make the site feel quite isolated. The hospice inpatient unit, and this is very much a personal perspective, whilst absolutely providing high quality care, does to some degree have a feel as a bit more of a hospital environment than what you would expect from a hospice. And I say that's a personal perspective, but it doesn't decry in any way from the care that's being provided. And I think, as I've already mentioned, the end-of-life services in Southampton are perhaps, and this is absolutely a fault of the commissioners, perhaps not joined up in the way that they could be. Working with all of our partners from a commissioning perspective, we absolutely recognised that there was a need for a new model in Southampton that ensured people were achieving things like their preferred place and working along to provide, to move care not just from being good, but to being outstanding. And certainly from a commissioner perspective, we felt there were opportunities in the local area to look at how we could do that delivery differently to move things forward. So from our perspective, the CCG, we absolutely worked with the NHS provider to look at how we could move towards being an independent hospice. And yes, to some degree, that is driven by the financial imperatives that the NHS is facing. So the process absolutely needed to be completed using a partnership approach, because we very much were conscious that actually both University Hospital Southampton, Countess Mountbatten, and whichever independent sector provider we ended up working with, actually all of them had very strong and very good reputations. And throughout this process, we were very conscious that we didn't want to do anything to compromise any of those, particularly around Countess Mountbatten, which is much loved in the local area. So, As an NHS Commissioning Quality Lead and a trustee at Mountbatten, I feel I've got quite a good understanding of what can be achieved in Countess Mountbatten in that alliance with the Isle of Wight, and I'm very much looking forward over the next few years to working with them. From my perspective, it's been quite challenging at times to recognise that I have a foot in both camps, and I've made sure that I've stepped away from any organisational processes to avoid that conflict of interest. And I think certainly from my perspective over the next couple of years, I want that opportunity to support both the CCG and the hospice team to drive up the quality of care. Because what I've seen and personally experienced on the Isle of Wight, because I happen to live over there as well, I want the opportunity to enable us to do some of the amazing things that are going on there in Southampton, and also take some of the really good things in Southampton back to the Isle of Wight. And I see that as a real partnership opportunity. I'm going to hand over to Sarah now, our chair, who's going to talk a bit more about the governance.
Good morning, everyone, and my name's Sarah Weech, and I'm the chair of, and I probably get this wrong, Mountbatten, Isle of Wight and Countess Mountbatten Hospice. What I want to do is just take you through the process we went through very briefly, and not trying to perhaps colour in some of the process that Nigel talked about, the governance we've put in place and how we got to that point, but most importantly probably the building and the maintaining of relationships and how we've really worked hard, all of us, to do that right across. To leave you with some learning points, they're my learning points, and just finally just to say a few thank yous, because this has been a real challenging journey that we've been on, and there's a lot of people to thank that we're still in one piece, all of us, I think. So Nigel covered the fact that partnership, and it involved numerous partners through this process, and I'm going to just concentrate particularly on the Mountbatten board and Countess Mountbatten Hospice charity, rather than the relationship particularly with the hospital, which was very important in this, and there's no reason for me not to talk more about that, but I was more involved in the relationship with Countess Mountbatten Hospice and our charity, our board. The most important thing, I think, was opening, maintaining, and going back round again the communication. And I spent most of this process developing a relationship with the board of Countess Mountbatten Charity Hospice, the charity arm, a small charity, as Nigel said, who had done amazing work in both raising money regularly in a small charity and supporting the hospice, but were not running the hospice. And they had to take the big decision that actually they were going to be subsumed really into Mountbatten, Isle of Wight. And that was a very big, major decision to go through and understand. And the emotional side of that was they'd looked after that charity, they'd provided that in great ways, and they were going to either walk away or join us in this journey, and that took a lot of conversations and relationships. And I really take my hat off to the trustees and the charity to step up to that and take that forward. Involved lots of lawyers and due diligence, and it was a complicated but really important part of the journey. A lot of the rest of my role, I think, in this process has been also working with our board in Mountbatten, because likewise they'd become a board to look after and hold in the governance arrangements for the people of the Isle of Wight, raising money for their hospice and running their hospice for the Isle of Wight. So we've been through, we've called numerous board meetings, lots of conversations, away days, thinking it through, getting ideas of how it might work, and being very clear of the reasons we're doing this. What was in it for Mountbatten, Isle of Wight, and what was in it for Countess Mountbatten and Southampton? They had to be reciprocal, otherwise it just wasn't going to work. And during those conversations, we agreed a number of red lines, really, the things that were really important to us, that we've bored many a project meeting by repeating endlessly to make sure that it was clear across the system where we were around that. And while Nigel has said the finance wasn't the major driver, and I would agree with that, we're constantly looking for the right thing to do rather than just what we can naturally afford. We were very clear that our compact with the island, who feels very precious about Mountbatten, as all your local communities feel about your hospice, is when they put money in that box, they expect it to look after their patients locally, and the island, as Nigel said, is there. So we were very clear that we had to be able to demonstrate that, and at no time jeopardise the island's sense that they had a hospice that was not going to be diluted by there's a great fear that everything's going to go off onto the mainland, and particularly healthcare, some of that is happening. So it's really important for that. So that was one of the red lines. We were very clear as a board that we had achieved great things on the island. We were judged as outstanding by the CQC, and we didn't want anything that was going to compromise that level of care that we were able to do. So we wanted to make sure that there was the capacity to take this on. And as Nigel said, we needed and we wanted to be very clear how we were going to explain this to the island, and that they were going to be comfortable with it. Unless they were able to do that, we wouldn't want to go forward. And Nigel had talked about how we developed our strategy, which was very much about how do we reach more people, and so this felt at the right step to take to be able to reach more people, but also to make sure from a board's point of view that we're sustainable. For me as chair, that feels probably my heaviest responsibility and duty, to make sure what we do today doesn't jeopardise the potential for being able to deliver it tomorrow as well. And this felt important. And as Nigel's mentioned, the changing health system around us meant we were looking for how do we become resilient. We either contracted to be manageable within the resources we've got and having lots to spare, or we stepped up and said, right, well, we'll go bigger. And we feel that's the right thing to do. So our final arrangements, and I won't go through this particularly, but that's our total governance structure. At the bottom, the yellow boxes are the internal operational. You probably can't see it very well. The operational meetings, and then you'll see the board is joint, but we have these 4 trustees, 2 from each of the separate entities. And some of our challenges now are, as we work this through, is how do we demonstrate and are assured that our decisions from one part of the organisation are matched and fair with the other. We had our first board meeting yesterday as a joint entity, and we had to agree and discuss the management recharge from one organisation to the other. And it was really important that those 4 trustees who are separate, who are represent Countess Mountbatten or Mountbatten, were able to feel comfortable that it was fair and negotiated right, because it would potentially be quite easy from the major stakeholder to take that over. So we're trying to do that. I have to say, probably one of the things we're really struggling with most is, where do we hold the meetings? Do we all meet on the Isle of Wight and everybody comes over from Southampton? Do we all go over to Southampton? You know, those practical issues that make a lot of difference for individuals are some of the things we're struggling with most. And I think the thing that I am thinking about most is, how do I develop those relationships with what now is quite a large board, with new trustees, develop those relationships so that our story becomes very one and the same, and we're all knowing each other well enough to challenge and provide the governance the organisation needs. So the learning from my point of view is we had to be clear why it's worth doing it and working at it. I'm a great one for great ideas, but you have to have the resilience behind you to keep at it and do it. And the SMT have been great at that. I think we had something to share and offer that was worth sharing, and we needed to be part of something bigger. I've learned that you need to constantly look at the world from your partner's perspective. It just won't be the same as yours. However obvious it is to you, it's not how they see it. Never assume what you've said is what has been heard. Never is. So endless phone calls, going back. What was meant with that? I thought this was what was said. This is what's written down. No, we didn't mean that. Endlessly going back and making sure you share those same stories. Keep checking back with everyone in the process that they're still with you on the journey, especially the quiet, angry, frustrated, sad ones. You need to have that out on the table. Keep talking about it and hear it and absorb it and work through it. It's sometimes me. But you need to keep checking that people are with you on the journey. One of our trustees decided that actually it wasn't for them. They put the hand up and said, I've heard it and I understand what you're doing, but for right now, that's not where I can go. And that's fine. But we kept checking back with them. Keep all the lines of communication open and then go back and do it all over again and again and again, and develop those relationships. Our business is about people, relationships, kindness, and compassion. And when you're doing something tricky, you need those with knobs on and keep doing it. So, and the final thing I'd say, and if Liz Arnold, our Director of Nursing, was here, she'd be very pleased. But for all that relationship communication, you need a really long action plan that you get on and do. And I'm not quite sure how long the action plan is now, but it's probably 200, 300 lines of it. And the team just relentlessly work through that action plan. And by constantly putting the patients and the people we're here to serve at the centre of that. So just finally, because I really would value your questions, an enormous thank you to a number of people, some of whom aren't here today. I want to thank very sincerely my fellow trustees, both at Countess Mountbatten and at Mountbatten. None of them came in to their roles thinking this is where we would end up, so we've all had to go back and think, can we do this? Because it's a lot more time, a lot more energy, a lot more thinking than perhaps we'd all thought initially. I wanted to thank particularly Countess Mountbatten Charity and Sue Hill, who's not here, I don't think, as the chair, who had to lead this process for the charity. And again, it wasn't what she signed up for, but she stepped up and took that, so thank you to her. The Hospital Trust and their senior team and CCGs. I've worked in the NHS for a long time, and I was really impressed with how, for a relatively small part of their system, they were spending so much time and energy in supporting this process. So thank you to them. And finally, but not least, the staff teams in both Mountbatten and Countess Mountbatten, and in particular the senior management team across both organisations. The hours that have been put in are really appreciated and acknowledged. And I know it's been exciting, but it's also been exhausting. There's been a lot of silliness or hilarity, really, I think, because of the exhaustion and the... if you don't know what else to do, you just have to laugh about it, really. And so there's been lots of hilarity on the boat trips backwards and forwards to Southampton. And I recognise the stress in the system that that's been created. But it so feels the right thing to do, that it's worth working at. And if we can get everybody facing the same way, then we seem to be getting there. And I'm very grateful for every single one of them who's stepped up to taking this on. So thank you, Nigel, and your team.
So just very quickly, some final thoughts and then hopefully some time for questions. I suppose, there are a lot of things to be focused on and thought about, and there's a huge amount of work to come, which is, in terms of years rather than weeks and months. The governance structure, as I mentioned earlier, it's right for now, but it's certainly not going to be right for the longer term, and we will be looking at that as we move forward. My sense of being at Countess Mountbatten is, I've been so moved by the staff and volunteers of how warm and kind and friendly they've been to us, and how ready they are for this. There feels a real appetite, and that's been quite an interesting an interesting experience. But really, I think there's a sense that there's been a lack of long-term investment from UHS. And I think one of the things for me is that the hospice has been part of a hospital trust. And of course, the drive and the real push towards community, the hospital management team saying to us, actually, we don't quite know how to do that. We need somebody who can help us and help the hospice do that into the future. They've been regulated with the CQC through the hospital. So from April, they will be regulated with the CQC separately as a hospice and will be looked at from that perspective for the first time. Data and IT, I know two of our guys, Duncan and Richard Easton, are here today, who are doing a huge amount of work on this. And, talking about individuals stepping up to the plate, without both of those two people at this particular time, we wouldn't be able to move to the next stage. I'm told there are 42 electronic systems at Countess Mountbatten Hospice. I think that's a really interesting point to make in terms of how you disentangle from those and actually go into the future, wherever that needs to be. Part of the glorious past of Countess Mountbatten has been around medicine, and Carol's been part of that. And it's been an extraordinary sort of model. But the future is going to be different to that. And we need to work through that together. And we are buying our medical team from the hospitals still. And by April, we're going to have a better understanding of what that needs to look like. Disentangling from the NHS, and I mean that in the best possible way, but there's stuff that goes on in terms of people's day-to-day work and behaviour that needs to change and be clarified in terms of as we move forward. We need to re-engage people with the values and the climate and the behaviours and the culture of the organisation. People talking about being abandoned, without leadership, service reduced due to funding issues. I think that's quite an interesting sort of sense of the morale in the organisation. And again, the management in the hospital saying to me, well, actually, I don't know what a bereavement service should look like. We actually don't know. Should a hospice have one? Actually, you can't have a hospice without a full, proper bereavement service. So from the 1st of April, that will be the first thing that goes back in place. It's not that there hasn't been one. It was just taken away. But as I said, there's a huge amount of optimism. I think what's been really interesting for me, sitting at Countess Mountbatten Hospice, and a couple of weeks ago, I found myself doing a shift on reception on a Monday morning, which was the most fascinating experience in terms of learning of how people behave and what goes on. And I spoke to a large number of patients and families who were going through, and the feedback they gave about what their experience and what they were getting was exactly the same as anyone on the Isle of Wight or Mountbatten would have said. They talked about it in the same language. They talked about it being extraordinary, feeling safe, feeling secure, feeling cared for, beyond any of their expectations. So what is it that makes quality? And I think that's a really interesting question. And actually, we need to listen more to those patients and families in terms of as we go forward. So to finish, I just wanted to finish with a quote from Cicely Saunders, who talked about creating a team who work together to relieve where they cannot heal, to keep the patient's own struggle within his own compass, and to bring hope and consolation to the end. It was never really intended to be rocket science. And I wonder whether what we've done is over-engineered an idea to a point where actually it's not really focused on the people who need it anymore, but on the people who provide it. So I think the note to myself is actually don't be tempted to over-engineer the future. I think we need to take time to really listen to what's needed. So thank you. Thank you to all my colleagues, and hopefully there is some time for questions if you'd like to ask them. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. So, Carl, got a microphone and probably some hands that will be raised. Have we got anywhere? Hard to see with these lights in our eyes, so there's one here.
Hello, Tracy Bleakley, Chief Executive of Hospice UK. Thank you so much to you all, not just for sharing a story, but also talking about the detail and exactly what you had to do to bring everybody with you. I thought that was fascinating and really useful for the hospice movement. My question, though, is about personal resilience of the four of you there. How did you manage to keep yourself going? We're talking about quite a few years and quite a complex process. Was there any times where you went home and thought, this is never going to work, or I can't believe we're doing this, or how on earth am I going to get through this problem? And what did you do to get through that?
Certainly from my perspective, is the mic on, yeah? Yes, all the time. Absolutely every night of the week going home thinking, you know, this is not going to happen. What do we have to do? Drinking a lot, probably. But, you know, I think Sarah mentioned it. My colleagues on the senior management team, there are 5 of us who, going through just the process with those 5 people, including myself, and the conversations and sitting down night after night, late into the night sometimes, really talking through whether this was the right thing to do, where were the blocks, who were the people we needed to go back to, which one of us was going to go back at this particular moment and have that conversation. And that is still ongoing. I mean, from a personal point of view in terms of resilience, I suppose at the moment I feel the most exhausted than I have done over the last few years, but that will change as we get into the next stage with the energy and motivation to move things forward. So at the moment, we're trying to say we're not going to do anything very much for a few months. We're just going to observe. I find that really hard. But actually, I'm really holding on to that as a piece of advice to myself. I don't know from others, but.
Is that on? No, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's on, okay. Yes, drink probably comes into it. But I think to a certain extent, as a chair, you're a little bit outside. But there were lots of phone calls with Nigel saying, oh, you know what now? And I suppose some of it was about holding that and ensuring neither one of us went off too bonkers about it at a particular time or celebrated too quickly. I mean, that's the other side of it. Some things went really, really well. The other trustees, we have a very, I would say, a very strong skill set around legal stuff, business processes and things like that. So they were very good people to check out ideas with. So I think we did well from a board's point of view to hold that together and keep talking. And I think I would go back to, we couldn't have done this, I don't think, if we didn't have those relationships to start with. We had to start on a sound basis. It would have been very difficult, I think, if we'd all been new. And as Nigel mentioned, the timing of it was just, things are never perfect, but just about right. It just was a perfect set of circumstances. We've become outstanding. We were all thinking, you know, we can do anything. We had high confidence, a strong, new, stable board, and an SMT who had the capacity to, you know, and what's next. So from that point of view, I think, and the other bit for me, it's not so much my resilience, but being very mindful of the exhaustion levels of the senior management team and what we can expect for that to go forward. So, thank you.
So I'm in a slightly different position in that the difficult time for me in terms of resilience was in 2015-16 when the future of the service wasn't clear. You know, life in the NHS is tough. I'm not saying it's not tough in other places, but, you know, I've written business cases before breakfast on occasions and all sorts of things like that. And even though I was based in the acute hospital, because I do, nowadays I'm mainly a purveyor of acute hospital palliative care, but not solely. And so I was rubbing shoulders with the chief exec, the finance team, the accountants, all those people. Whatever I and others seemed to do, we felt like we were at an impasse and that the glorious potential of CMH was a bit going down the tubes, and I think I already said that in my talk. So that was the more wobbly time for me. It was time anyway. I'd led the service for a decade, or over a decade, so it was time to hand over last year. So I'm now more, not on the sidelines, but I'm not directly involved. And I see it with excitement, as I said in my talk. But I think that's the thing about wobbly periods, isn't it? Everyone has a different wobbly period at a different time, and perhaps we all need to watch out for each other.
Yeah, I think I would support, having been to some degree a bit on the periphery of seeing all of this going on over the last couple of years. I think for me, some of the challenges that Mountbatten Isle of Wight's faced in the past have probably been more significant for me personally than what's going on now. And actually, I very much see this as a real opportunity to do something amazing. And for me, if we can just continue to provide high quality care for people in both settings, then that's what it's all about.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm conscious we have actually gone past 10 o'clock, but can we just see if we can squeeze in an extra question or two? Is there any hands raised out there?
Thank you. It's fascinating and brilliantly brave. I'm fascinated. You mentioned at the beginning, Nigel, that you had 33% for your funding from the CCG. I just wondered if you were able to share financially how much both organisations have put together to make this happen.
I suppose in terms of the cost of the whole exercise, it's mostly been around legal costs. So that's been the biggest spend. As we go forward, as Sarah said, one of our biggest challenges is how we move money or sort of cross-charge money across the two things. So, we've decided that we are going to have one senior management team and have one extra member. So half of the senior management team will be paid from Southampton. So that's a financial benefit to Mountbatten Isle of Wight right up front. I mean, we have to do probably twice as much work for that. So there hasn't been a huge amount of money to make it happen. I suppose our challenge is how we move the financial envelope on the other side of the water to the right place in a timely way, so that we can engage the local community probably in a lot more effective way. I mean, the charity have worked really hard with the local community, but it's very obvious they haven't had the resource or the capacity to really go out there and sell this service as a charity and get the local community to fall in love with it. So that will be a real challenge for us as we move forward. But what's really interesting is both the University Hospital and the CCGs are so committed to this. They've said, 3 to 5 years, if you haven't quite got to where we need to get to, we're not going to pull out because we want this to work. So we have quite a sort of malleable relationship in that sense. So we'll see. But in terms of the actual investment financially, it hasn't been huge, but there's been a huge amount of personal resource having to put our sort of energy and time into it for it to make it happen.
Okay, thank you. Shall we just try to squeeze in one more question? One more in the room.
Richard Soulsby, Chief Executive at Catherine House Hospice in Stafford. I just heard some oblique references to patients in terms of reaching more people. That was something that Sarah mentioned and Carol mentioned about exchanging good areas of good practice. To what extent have you been able to articulate up front the benefits that you're expecting patients to get from this integration or merger?
I suppose quite a lot of that has been to do with replicating some of the services we've set up on the island that I sort of briefly mentioned around reaching more people on the island. So, for instance, the coordination centre, it's probably going to be a lot more cost-effective and possible to sort of provide that kind of service across a much wider geographical area without too much cost. So those kinds of things really have been drivers, I think, from the CCGs, particularly around saying, well, actually, we want our hospice to look like that. We want our community services to look like that. And I think there's been a real lack of integration around community services, particularly across Southampton and West Hampshire, that on the island we've managed to find a way of cracking. So hopefully the sort of growth in numbers will come from the innovative ideas that we've tried out on the island, tested, and they work, and we're able to replicate them and sustain them in other areas. So that's part of the answer to that.
And I think I'd just add two sides. One is to make sure we don't lose any of the quality of the services we're providing patients on the island. But we know, and Nigel was only telling us yesterday at the board, that increasing numbers of families are ringing us from Southampton to ask for, because they know us individually, for help back for their island families on the mainland coming back to the island for care. But they've done that through a personal route that they know somebody to ring. And so we know we're missing people. It's not so much those people, we can help them, but it's the ones we don't know. So I think we'll join that up much more. So that's a benefit for island patients. And as Nigel said already, the services for people in Southampton and Countess Mountbatten, it needs to get back to its glory days, and that's particularly about the relationship with the community. So it's sustaining what we do on the island already, providing that in Southampton and making sure we could reach those who leave the island for whatever reason but want to come back for their end-of-life care and not losing them in the system somehow.
Okay, thank you. I think what this session has taught us is that trust is the key to these sort of relationships, and it is about bringing along boards with you because the boards are going to be the arbiters as to whether that's the right thing for your organisation or not. I did like the comment about the red line in terms of supporting your local community, and that's why people do support a hospice. It is to support the local community and not to think that their money is going to be used in some other organisation. I think that's really important. I think the transparency and fairness is absolutely key. I think it's about, as I say, bringing along all staff and need to be clear why you're doing it so that everyone is aware that there are sort of mutual advantages to it. The driver of population need is absolutely clear. It's not just about bringing organisations together because they just happen to be in the same geographical area. It has to be about reaching more people. And I think it's about starting small with all these types of arrangements. I know in the Northwest where we have 7, 8 or 9 hospices all working together, I think you have to start on a small scale first and then work up. Don't expect to start and change the world. And gain confidence. And the fact that history is so important within the hospice movement. The history has to be respective of each organisation because it is so important to us. Communications also is really important. Can I thank the panel of Nigel, Sarah and the 2 Carols for their great contribution to the conference today. I'm sure we've all learned a great deal and I've made quite a lot of notes. If you want to catch them, I'm sure they'll be around during the conference, so I'm sure we'll have other questions for them. So can we say thank you to the panel? Thank you.